The Falklands War was not only fought in the South Atlantic, it was also fought in silence, in decisions that were never announced, and in missions that officially never existed. In the first days of May 1982, while the world watched the sinking of the ARA General Belgrano, something very different was happening thousands of kilometers from the front. 10 Mirage aircraft took off in secret from southern Peru, bound for a destination that appeared in no communiqué, on a mission that no one was supposed to know about. Their pilots did not know how long the journey would last or what consequences it might bring. They knew only one thing. They had to disappear from radar and reach Argentina. What happened next does not appear in books, was not taught in academies, and for decades was kept in silence. This is the story of an aid that crossed borders without a flag, of a war that could have changed, and of a mission that was ready to fight, even though it never fired a single missile. The early hours of May 4th, 1982 did not begin with sirens or shouted orders. It began in hushed tones, almost in whispers, at La Joya Air Base in southern Peru. It was not a standard alert. There were no visible formations, no unnecessary movements. The hangars remained closed longer than usual, and the lights only illuminated what was strictly necessary. Everything had been designed to avoid drawing attention. 2 days earlier, the ARA General Belgrano had been sunk. The message was clear. The war had entered a phase of no return. While international attention was fixed on the South Atlantic, on that silent runway, an operation was being prepared that could not officially exist. 10 Mirage M5P fighters stood lined up, accompanied by a small group of technicians, spare parts, and essential equipment. This was no routine deployment. It was a gamble measured to the millimeter. The pilots had been summoned urgently, from one day to the next. There were no long explanations or unnecessary details, only one non-negotiable condition: total isolation. They could not notify their families, could not ask questions, could not leave a trace. The mission would be absolutely secret. Not even they knew exactly what they were getting into. Before takeoff, something crucial happened. The markings and registration numbers were removed from the aircraft. When those Mirages left the runway, they would cease to belong to any country, at least in appearance. But the risk was not only in the destination. According to former members of the Peruvian Air Force who would speak out years later, it was already known that Chile had activated aerial surveillance in the north, alert to any unusual movement in the region. That meant it was not just a matter of crossing borders in silence. It meant doing so under observation, avoiding radars, interceptions, and any signal that could trigger a regional alarm. The mechanics carried out their final checks without ceremony. The pilots climbed into the cockpits without farewells. When the engines came to life, the sound was contained within the base, as if even the air knew it had to keep quiet. The takeoff was clean and precise. As the Mirages gained altitude, the world was left behind. The real enemy was not yet combat. It was the distance, the silence, and the invisible eyes watching from the South American sky. Every kilometer without incident meant the plan was still intact. Because reaching Argentina was not the end of the mission. It was barely the beginning. The Mirages advanced in absolute silence. No radio communications, no margin for error. They flew at high altitude, following routes calculated to avoid the most heavily monitored corridors. Every heading adjustment had been planned before takeoff because a single transmission could give them away. On that crossing, the sky was not a neutral space. It was observed territory. To the north, Chile kept its aircraft on alert, watching for any movement that might upset the regional balance. To the east, International listening systems tracked signals that were not supposed to exist. And beyond all of that, the war in the South Atlantic continued its course, unaware that something was moving behind the curtain. For the Peruvian pilots, the journey was a strange mixture of concentration and emptiness. They did not know whether they were crossing a geographic border or a far more dangerous political one. Every minute in the air confirmed that there was no turning back. When they finally began their descent toward Argentine soil, the relief was brief, because landing did not mean safety. On the ground, Argentine officers were waiting, and they immediately understood the magnitude of the gesture. There were no speeches, no formal ceremonies, no records, only firm handshakes and glances that said more than any words could express. Those aircraft had not arrived as visible reinforcements. They had arrived as a possibility. The Mirages were taken to discreet hangars. They were not displayed, not announced. Within hours, Peruvians and Argentines began working as if they had always been part of the same squadron. Maps, routines, and procedures were shared. They discussed low-level flight profiles, fuel consumption, how to attack without being detected by naval radars. The political context stayed outside those rooms. Only one thing mattered there. What could be done if the order came? Meanwhile, in the South Atlantic, the British fleet continued tightening its grip. The Sea Harriers patrolled like absolute masters of the sky, fast, maneuverable, equipped with missiles that surpassed any possible technical equality. Every Argentine sortie required creativity, courage, and extreme risk. That is why the arrival of the Peruvian aircraft was not seen as an immediate shift in the military balance. It was something more subtle, a breath of fresh air, an extra option in a war where options were beginning to run out. And although no one could say it aloud, everyone knew. If the war extended, those Mirages could become a decisive factor. The problem was one and only one: time. The days passed, and the Mirages remained on the ground, lined up, checked over and over, ready. Every morning began the same way: technical checks, brief meetings, maps spread across improvised tables. There was no comfortable routine, because everyone knew the order could come at any moment. The Peruvian pilots had not crossed half a continent to observe. They had come prepared to fight. But in this war, firing was not always the first decision. At Tandil, the work was silent and constant. Procedures were refined, naval attack profiles were sharpened, discussions were held about how to fly low, how much fuel to spend, how much to risk. No one talked about heroism, they talked about survival. Meanwhile, the aid was not limited to the aircraft. Fuel tanks arrived, ammunition, bombs, missiles that expanded real attack possibilities. Spare parts, too, obtained through third countries, components that Argentina could not acquire through normal channels. Every shipment was a gamble, every movement a diplomatic risk. In Lima, silence was just as important as the aid itself. Nothing could leak, nothing could be confirmed. A single public indication could turn that secret collaboration into an international incident. One photograph, one intercepted call, one piece of misinterpreted information was enough to set off a regional alarm that could not be extinguished. And yet, the support continued. In that context, the Peruvian pilots understood something with absolute clarity. Their mission was not to fly over the Falklands. Their mission was to make it possible for others to do so. But war does not stop to wait for perfect plans. Every day brought new reports from the South. More combat, more losses, more urgency. The question began to change shape. It was no longer whether the Mirages would enter combat. It was whether they would do so in time. And that uncertainty began to weigh more heavily than any missile under their wings. The war was advancing faster than any planning. While routes were being adjusted and flight profiles memorized at Tandil, in the South Atlantic, the fighting continued without pause. Each day brought new reports, and they were almost never good. The mirages were ready. The crews were too. But a war is not won with available aircraft alone. It is won with synchronization. The Peruvian pilots spent hours going over maps of southern Argentina, studying low-altitude approach routes to avoid naval radars, analyzing how to enter and exit a real attack and come back alive. Minor details were corrected, common mistakes pointed out, experiences shared. They did not talk about glory. They talked about how to get home. As the days passed without a definitive order, the atmosphere began to shift. Silences grew longer. Conversations were cut short before they finished. Everyone felt the same thing, though no one said it aloud. The strategic window was closing. British Sea Harriers continued asserting their dominance. At sea, the fleet adjusted positions and reinforced defenses. Every engagement pushed the conflict closer to an inevitable conclusion. The Peruvian pilots noticed it in the gestures, in the way maps were studied, in how often plans were reviewed that might never be executed. They had agreed to fly without officially existing. They had crossed invisible borders. They had placed their country in an extremely delicate position. And yet the most difficult realization was beginning to surface. Perhaps there would be no combat for them, not for lack of will, not for lack of means, but because the war, indifferent to all preparations, was deciding otherwise. In the air, time is measured in seconds. In politics, it is measured in days. And those days were beginning to weigh too heavily. As the days advanced, the Peruvian presence began to fade from the visible surface of the conflict, though not from its real impact. The mirages remained on the ground, lined up, checked over and over again. There was no visible anxiety, only a quiet discipline. Each pilot knew that his role was not measured in flight hours, but in readiness. And in an air war, that was already a form of combat. Meanwhile, aid kept arriving through less visible channels. Fuel tanks that extended the range of Argentine missions, ammunition that sustained the operational tempo, missiles, and spare parts obtained through third countries, components Argentina could not acquire directly. Nothing carried labels. Nothing appeared in official communiques. It was a parallel war, fought in hangars, depots, and discrete logistics routes. A war of technical compatibility, improvised solutions, and decisions made against the clock. Peruvian technicians worked side by side with Argentines as if they had always been part of the same squadron. They adjusted systems, adapted procedures, solved problems that appeared in no manual. Every detail could make a difference. Even more delicate options were explored. The possibility of obtaining additional Exocet missiles was analyzed outside the continent. Not everything went as planned. Some shipments never arrived. But even the failed attempts carried strategic weight. They demonstrated how far Peru was willing to go without crossing a line that would make the conflict irreversible. In the hangars, the pilots understood something key. Even if they never took off toward the Falklands, their mission was already having an effect. The mere possibility that those aircraft might enter combat forced the enemy to consider additional scenarios. And in modern warfare, making the rival doubt is also a weapon. But the end was approaching. Reports from the south spoke of exhaustion, of compromised positions, of a conflict advancing toward its conclusion. The margin for direct intervention was shrinking every day. And then, the men who had crossed the continent in secret came to accept a difficult truth. Sometimes, the most decisive form of aid is the one that never becomes visible, because its effect was already produced before a single missile was fired. The war did not end with one last great battle. It ended all at once. In the early days of June, something changed at Argentine bases. It was not a clear order or an official announcement. It was more subtle. Fewer flights, fewer urgencies, more silence in corridors where everything used to be said quickly and in low voices. The front was giving way. British forces were advancing on key positions across the islands, and every report arriving from the south confirmed what no one wanted to say aloud. The room for maneuver had run out. There was no time for new cards on the table. The mirages were still there, loaded, impeccable, ready. But the war was already deciding its own ending. For the Peruvian pilots, the waiting became strange. It was not relief nor open frustration. It was something harder to explain. They had accepted an enormous risk, perhaps only to never cross the final threshold. They had flown in secret, prepared for real combat, taken on consequences that could have changed history. And yet, the outcome did not need them in the air. On June 14, 1982, Argentina announced its surrender. The news traveled through the bases without noise. No celebrations, no theatrical gestures, only a shared certainty. It was all over. In that same instant, the Peruvian mission passed definitively into the realm of the invisible. It never appeared in the war reports, never featured in the final communiques. For years, it was absent from public memory as well. The mirages did not fly to the Falklands. The missiles were not launched. The pilots returned home without visible medals, but with something that no one who was there ever doubted. If the war had lasted a little longer, if the calendar had played out differently, those aircraft would have entered combat. It did not happen. But in war, as in life, what does not occur also leaves its mark. In the early hours of May 4th, 1982, Peru crossed an invisible line, not with declarations, not with troops, but with something far more delicate, an absolute willingness to accept the consequences. And when it was all over, that line was erased again, as if it had never existed. But it did exist. Because in the Falklands War, there were gestures that never fired a single missile and yet weighed as heavily as any attack. If this account helped you understand a part of the war that almost no one told, subscribe here. History is not shouted, it is remembered.